Okay, we'll get moving on. Again, thank you so much everybody for coming. Um, and again, my name is Matthew. Um, you may have forgotten me because I've been away a lot recently. I'm a bit of a part-timer these days. But thank you for all your love and patience and kindness towards me. So really appreciate it. Um, so today is actually the first Sunday of Lent. Some of us were able to come to the Ash Wednesday service this previous Wednesday, which was the first day of Lent. Today's the first Sunday. Lent lasts 40 days. It's representative, not including Sunday. You know, it's a weird kind of thing. You get Sunday, which is kind of the most religious day of the week in many respects for the Christian tradition. Turns out you get Sundays off during Lent. So that 40-day period is representative of Jesus's time in the wilderness. We kind of reflected on that a little bit this past Wednesday during Ash Wednesday. Lent's a season of self-reflection, again, in keeping with that time that Jesus spent in the wilderness where he was tested, tempted, the scriptures tell us. Jesus was kind of in this very intense period of his life where a lot of things were getting sorted out. I think motive, purpose, all sorts of things. And so we kind of, every year, we mark this season. Different traditions mark it in different ways, but we mark it in a very simple way as a season of self-reflection. Now, hopefully we're as followers of Jesus, we're in that kind of mode all the time. We're rethinking and reevaluating, reflecting on ourselves and how we need to change, and opening ourselves to new possibilities, and God's Spirit working in us and transforming us. But I think it's always really great and helpful to have particular seasons where we focus intently on that. It's a little bit like, but that's I think, value of the rhythm of a calendar. Like we celebrate the birth of Jesus. So incarnation is something that is part of us and a part of our faith all the time, but we take moments where we particularly focus on it. We think about death and resurrection at Easter, don't we? And that's what Lent is leading up to. And it's really helpful to remind ourselves and to root ourselves and ground ourselves again in things that are so important. And that's really what Lent is about. Lent, though, is not a time where we want to beat ourselves up. It's not a judgmental time. It's not a time when we sort of cower under this the glare of God, who disapproves of all kinds of things in our lives. I mean, there's all kinds of things in my life that merit disapproval. I mean, I think that's probably true for all of us. Nobody's perfect. But this is judgment and guilt and pointing the finger isn't going to change anything. I mean, that's really not a great motivation. What is truly transforming is love. And so we see Lent as this, and hopefully we'll kind of see a little bit of that today, as an invitation of people who are struggling, people like us who don't have it all together, an invitation into life, an invitation of love into new possibilities, new ways of living. So it's something really positive, something really beautiful. It's also pretty serious because we want to take our lives seriously. We want to take our faith seriously. We recognize that actually the world's a serious place, right? Life is pretty serious. We can't really be frivolous about it, especially at the moment when there's so much pain and suffering. So it's serious, but it's not something that we're going to allow to oppress us or overwhelm us. But again, it's an invitation into love. We've called this series Jesus Manifesto of Love, Peace, and Justice because for the next few weeks during Lent, we're going to be looking at what's become known as the Sermon on the Mount. That's a series of teaching by Jesus in Matthew's Gospel from chapters 5 through 7. Obviously we need to remember that verses and chapters in the scriptures were added in centuries later. So, they're artificial divisions in many respects. But in that section, chapter 5, 6, and 7, we have a teaching of Jesus that's become known as the Sermon on the Mount. And it's very much, you could say, a manifesto. It's Jesus really laying out some really profound ethical teaching. And it's something we dip into periodically a lot, I think. So a lot of the passages we'll look at over the next few weeks will probably be quite familiar to us if you've been coming here for any length of time. But But it's one of those things where it's not like, okay, I've read that, I'm done. This is a profound teaching that we keep coming back to. I mean, I've often felt like if all we ever did was look at the Sermon on the Mount, week in, week out, two things might happen. One, we'd probably run the church down to about 10 people because, it would just be overwhelmingly boring eventually, right? If you just talk about the same thing. But also, if we really internalized that, if we took these teachings and went away and really applied them, some incredible things would happen. And so the fact that I know, speaking for myself, more incredible things need to happen, more change needs to happen in my life. So I need to come back to it because it's not just head knowledge, it's inner transformation that we're talking about. So that's my apologetic, I guess, for talking about a subject matter that we go to quite frequently, and we probably will keep coming back to it. But that's what we're going to do for this season of Lent. The passage or this section that we're going to be looking at is the first of 5 discourses in Matthew's Gospel. So the way the author of Matthew puts this account of Jesus' life together is to sort of center it around 5 big sections of teaching. This is the first one of them, and many would say perhaps the most profound. And that's, it's interesting because scholars would say that might be a kind of representation, a representation of the 5 books of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. It's kind of like Jesus's law, if you like, the Torah being the Hebrew law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy were what the Christian tradition calls the Pentateuch. They're the 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of the law. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that might be the reason the author put them together, like put these 5 discourses together, because there's many comparisons in Matthew's account. Whoever wrote Matthew, it's called Matthew's Gospel. We don't really know who wrote the book. The author didn't give their name. But whoever put it all together seems to be signaling to us that Jesus is like a new Moses, a second Moses. There's lots of comparisons to the life of Moses in the life of Jesus, the way this particular author tells it. So the other Gospels tell the story in different ways. But Matthew seems to be showing us something that Jesus is like a Moses. And there's a reason for that. It's not just like, oh, Moses was great, Jesus is great. There's some reasons behind that. And some of we talked about this a little bit before, I think during Christmas, actually, in the Advent season, in the birth narrative of Jesus in Matthew. There's lots of comparisons to the birth narrative and the early days of Moses. And as we come to this season of Lent, when we look at the story of Moses, Moses crossed a sea, crossed a body of water, the Red Sea, the Sea of Reed, and went into the wilderness, led the people of Israel into the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus crosses the Jordan and goes into the wilderness for 40 days and nights. And that's, I think, probably significant. That's not a coincidence in the way that Matthew's telling the story. And then Moses goes, during that time in the wilderness, goes up a mountain, Mount Sinai. And there's thunder and lightning, and it's all very dramatic. And Moses is given the law, and we read about the 10 Commandments. And in this beginning of this passage, the Sermon on the Mount with Jesus, we read something similar. Now, when Jesus saw the crowd, so this is the first couple of verses of this discourse, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach. Now, Jesus is seated because that's the traditional posture of a rabbi who's teaching. They would always sit down. So we've got this, as we've said before, we've got this sort of expectation of this. Jesus is set up as this new Moses. What law is, he's gone up the mountain, what law is Jesus going to bring? And, if you remember, from the story in Exodus about Moses going up the mountain, pretty much the first thing that Moses says, which is the 10 Commandments, is, thou shalt have no other gods before me, which is the first commandment. And, I mean, that's, we need to be fair to this. That needs unpacking and contextualizing and all the rest of it. But it's very dramatic. It's kind of got that mode to it, right? If you've ever seen that movie. it feels a little bit defensive, right? If the first thing that, let's just imagine you're in charge of the whole universe. There's no real reason to be insecure, I wouldn't think, to say, don't have anybody ahead of me. It's like, if you're actually the head of everything, then, be a bit more confident, be a bit more at ease with yourself. But according to tradition, that God felt that was the first thing that needed to be said. We probably don't now, because we're very sophisticated right now, so we probably don't have a visual image of who or whatever God is, like this kind of, that's Moses, not God, but that kind of image of almost has a sort of deistic aspect to it. But maybe emotionally, we relate to God like that. Even if we know, well, that's not really who God is. We might have this sort of, you better not, you better do, you better, and the sort of the pointing finger, and feeling like we're constantly under the gaze of someone who just always disapproves, because you're never quite right. So when Jesus gets up on the mountainside and we're waiting with bated breath for what Jesus is going to say, he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's really the first teaching that comes out of the mouth of Jesus. And Jesus is bringing a whole different approach to the law, the way to live. That was the goal of the Torah, the law, was to help people live in unity and union with one another and with God. It was meant to be shalom, peace, just life as it should be. That was the intent of it. But it often got interpreted in different ways. And Jesus is surprisingly returning us to perhaps what it was all about in the first place. And this term, or this saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's the first of the Beatitudes. And I don't want to say too much about, I'm just going to mention this one, not say too much about the others, because we're going to talk about that next week. Rachel Anderson is going to speak next week. She's got a great message lined up about the Beatitudes. So I don't want to overlap there too much. But just since this is the first thing Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I think there's some interesting things in here that can help set us up for the rest of this series. And I've called today beginning with the end in mind, because we're actually going to touch on a couple of things at the beginning and then jump to the end of the Sermon on the Mount as a way of putting some things in perspective and context for us as we go through this season of Lent. So here's the beginning. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So the poor in spirit. Now, it's interesting that in Luke's gospel, Jesus says, blessed are the poor. Tokos is the word in Greek there for poor. And the author of Matthew uses the same word. But the author of Matthew adds in spirit. Now, I think there's something great about Luke's version of this, because Luke is saying, blessed are the poor. It's just plain and simple. It's like, has an economic, social aspect to it, which is, there's no muddying of the waters. It's all, blessed are the poor. Either Luke takes away in spirit or Matthew has added it in. They're working off similar sources, probably. But whatever happened here, the author of Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit, the poor in pneuma, which, as we've said many times before, the word for spirit and the word for breath are the same in many ancient languages, including ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew. So we could say that, or Jesus could be saying here, blessed are the short in breath. Which, yeah, that sounds kind of funny because it's almost like a medical condition. But think of it like this. Maybe it's blessed are the tired. Blessed are the worn out. Blessed are you if you've had the life squeezed out of you. And you think about what I can't breathe means to us now in our context, words that have been used by so many people who have had literally the life squeezed out of them through oppression. So Jesus could be saying here, blessed are the marginalized, blessed are the oppressed, right? That could be what Jesus is saying. But also, blessed are the poor in spirit. If we take pneuma to mean spirit, the presence of God with us, so the ancients sort of had this sense that breath was the divine presence. I mean, breath gives us life. We breathe it in, we breathe it out, we breathe it in, we breathe it. It's omnipresent. We need it. You can't see it. It's mysterious, especially in ancient times. We understand more about it now, of course. But blessed are those who don't have that. So in other words, perhaps Jesus is saying, blessed are you if God feels distant. Blessed are you if you don't feel close to God. Blessed are you if you feel rejected or left out, or that you're unworthy, or you don't belong. It's an incredible way to start. And it sort of sets us up for this whole turning on its head that Jesus is going to do, with not just what the law means, what the way of God means, but what God is like. Jesus is redefining for us. I'm going to see this as we go through this series. Jesus is redefining God for everybody. And in this culture at this time, there were many people who were viewed as being problems, that they not only were they distant from God, or that were they sort of on the margins of God's reach, but they were also a problem. So they're a problem to themselves. In other words, they behaved certain ways, or they were born into certain families, or they had certain illnesses that meant they were kind of imperfect and pushed out to the margin. And that's bad for them. But not only was it bad for them, it was bad for society. They were the reason why Israel was being judged by God, because of all their misbehaviors, and they weren't right and they weren't good. And that's why the country wasn't doing very well. And I think we live in similar times now, don't we? Where various groups are just blamed for all the problem. And Jesus comes along and says, blessed are you, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven, which sounds like a really powerful thing, right? The kingdom of heaven. And we'll talk more about what this kingdom of heaven is as we go through the series. Or should I say, we'll talk more about what it might be, because who has the ownership of that definition? So Jesus, when he talked about the kingdom of heaven and inviting in people who wouldn't have been thought of being kingdom type people, powerful people, or owners of power, or owners of God's power, or a sense of belonging to God and God's community. That word kingdom, I think, can be a little confusing, right? A little tricky, because kingdom is associated with power. So this could be, kings, kingdoms, monarchy, rulers. This could kind of sound like Jesus is turning things upside down, and now a different group of people are on top. They've got the power, and the other people are underneath, and they're the ones who are going to be subjugated. But as we go through this series, we'll see that's not what Jesus is talking about at all. Right? Jesus is saying there's another way to live, and that way is perhaps. Well, let me put this out. Perhaps Jesus is saying there is another way to live, and if you don't have much, if you've had the life squeezed out of you, if you feel God is distant, you might be more ready to receive this way of living than if you're full up with your own satisfied life and sense of entitlement, sense of privilege. That if we feel that way, we might be least likely to see what Jesus is talking about and experience what Jesus is talking about. And if we don't have that, we're more likely, and that's good news. But it's not about, now I've got the power. Jesus is going to teach us a way that is a whole redefinition of what power is. It's based on love. It's based on the bottom coming up rather than the top coming down. So Jesus' way is a way of servant. Unless you become a servant, it's impossible to see the kingdom. Unless you become like a child, it's impossible to see the kingdom. If you want to be first, you're not going to see the kingdom. If you're willing to be last, you will see the kingdom. This is a new way of living where it's based on a whole different way of life. And that's the profundity of what Jesus is talking about in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's at times confusing, always challenging, but something really beautiful. And something actually that I think was the intention of the law in the first place. That's what Jesus seems to be hinting at. That, I've not come to abolish it. I've not come to dismiss the previous way of doing things. I've come to fulfill it by reinterpreting it and getting back to what was the intention of it. And the prophets were always doing this. In Ezekiel, it says this: I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people and I will be your God. In other words, this isn't meant to be top down. This isn't meant to be thou shalt this and thou shalt that, and you better get your act together. This is an invitation, always was an invitation into a relationship, into communion, into union with God and union with one another. In the prophet Jeremiah, it says something very, very similar. But this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them. I will put the Torah on the inside, not just imposed from the outside. I will write it in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer shall they teach one another or say to each other, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, says the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. So there's this beautiful intention that the prophets, the Hebrew prophets, centuries before Jesus, were always calling the people back to. So Jesus comes in that spirit and redefines law for us, redefines who God is, brings us back to the center of it all, which is love, and invites us to participate, invites us to experience it in profound ways, and in ways that, as we go through this series, will be transformative, not just for us individually, but for the world. And by way of introduction, just want to look at 4 metaphors. We'll be brief on each of them, I promise you. 4 metaphors, 1 at the beginning and 3 at the end, that kind of set this up as we walk this journey together. The first one, so beginning with the end in mind, 4 metaphors. The first one is salt and light. Salt and light. Again, right near the beginning, chapter 5, Jesus says this: you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. So Jesus is saying, you're salt. We'll come back to that in a second. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. I'm not even going to touch on light of the world, because Nikki talked about that and did an amazing job on it 4 or 5 weeks ago, just after Christmas. So, I would just look really foolish in light of that great message, right? So I'm just going to avoid that. But what I will mention a little bit about is salt of the earth. So, well, all I say on light of the world is that beautiful image. And again, go back and listen to that message, but that beautiful image of just shining, just being ourselves, being our true selves, and letting that shine out into the world. And light of the world, the word world there in the Greek, it's cosmos. It has this sense of the universe, even like shining into the universe, something very universal and beautiful. Salt of the earth is a little different. The term for earth there in the Greek it's the word ge, right, which is ge or gamma epsilon, the short word, but so transliteration would be ge, from which we get geography, geology, geode, even the name George, right? That means farmer, actually. So it's about the ground, the earth. It's very grounded. It's very rooted. And we are the salt of this earth. Now, interestingly, on Ash Wednesday, just a few days ago, we talked about the earth. We talked about dust, because in one of the Hebrew creation stories at the beginning of the Bible, it talks about dust. It says that God made Adam, the name Adam, which means the man, out of the dust, Adamah. And there's a sort of there's a connection between humanity and the dust. We're part of this earth. If you actually look in the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, so a few centuries before Jesus, they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. You can read it. You can get a copy of it and read it. They translate into the Greek that dust word. They translate it gay. They use the same word here that Jesus is speaking Aramaic, but the same word that's used to translate what Jesus's words were in the New Testament. So Jesus kind of is reminding us, I think, that we're part of this earth. We're not above it. We're not trying to escape it. The kingdom of heaven, in other words, is here and now. It's not just some other world that we're going to escape to one day. And we are the salt of this earth. We're so sprinkled into this earth, this dust that we inhabit. And salt, obviously, and there's all kinds of potential meanings for this metaphor of salt. I mean, loads of them. You can look up a bunch. But I'll just touch on a couple. One is salt is a seasoning, right? That's pretty obvious. We relate to salt that way. So Jesus is kind of saying, perhaps, what do you taste like? What's it like to be around you? What kind of influence are you having on your surroundings? What kind of influence are you having on this bit of dust that you inhabit? This bit of real life earth. Okay, not so much the cosmos, but this little patch that we inhabit. What does it taste like? What impact are we having on it? And inferring that perhaps we could point at all the negatives, all the things that are wrong with this piece of earth. But Jesus is setting this whole message up, this sermon up with, but you're the salt. So what kind of influence are we? It's a little bit like the saying we use here a lot, which is sort of based on a saying accredited to Gandhi, but I don't think he ever used these words exactly. But that whole be the change you want to see in the world, right? It's very easy to point and say the world's not this, the world's not that. This needs to change, that needs to change. But are we salty enough? Are our lives salty enough that we are being that change? Another metaphor for salt, or another way in which salt is a metaphor, is preservation, right? We use salt to preserve things. And again, we might feel the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And for some people, we might be okay about that, right? Let's hope they get their comeuppance. Or maybe we feel hopeless because it's just, where's this going to end? Where's society going? Where's our world going? Well, Jesus seems to be saying, okay, in your little patch of earth that you inhabit, you're a preservative. You're saving things. Like this, God's not given up on the earth. And we are this preservation. We're kind of anti-decay. We're anti-destruction. We're anti just going down that pathway to a pretty bad destination. You know, so we embody something very differently. That seems to be what Jesus is saying. So that's what Jesus is setting this up at the beginning, kind of raising the bar a little bit, I think, for us in many respects. Okay, let's jump to the end. So salt and light, Jesus says, uses also at the end the metaphor of good and bad fruit. This is one perhaps a little more obvious. By their fruit, you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. So Jesus here is saying, look, you've got to be real. You've got to be honest. You've got to be, this is the only reason that we have anything to share with anybody else is if we're producing good fruit. I mean, ideas and beliefs aren't going to save anybody. They're not going to change anything, I don't think. Now, this doesn't mean that ideas and beliefs aren't important. Of course they are. And ideas and beliefs can actually lead to positive change and positive fruit. But does it work? Is it producing something really good in us? And I think we all look back on history and recognize that frequently following Jesus or being a Christian hasn't necessarily meant better people and better society. And I think Jesus is just really honestly saying, here's the litmus test. Not to condemn, not to judge, but just to kind of invite us into reality, invite us into what's going on in our lives. So this season of Lent is an opportunity for us to not condemn ourselves or blame ourselves, but to say, okay, there's some things in my life that need to change. The runoff from my life, the living downstream from me might not be all that great. So I have things that I need to address in my life. Another metaphor is the wide and narrow gates. So Jesus says, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Now, this kind of couple of negative interpretations of this, I think, is like Jesus is saying, I bet you can't find it. My way is so difficult, you're not going to find it. I don't think Jesus means that. Another way of interpreting this, one that I was brought up with really was that, the narrow gate is the austere, difficult way of Jesus. And the wide gate is everything that's basically fun in life, which by definition is wrong, right? So, and I don't think that's what Jesus means either. I think Jesus is saying here, look, this is not easy. This is not easy. It's counterintuitive many, many times. It's not easy. We might have a go at it and not like it. We might miss it completely. We might not see it. Like, I wonder if there's a part of this is Jesus alluding to, it takes great intentionality. It's not just going to happen. The wide gate just happens. It's a big funnel. The narrow gate is like being really intentional about our lives, purposeful, honest, self-reflective, etc. I also wonder if there's an element of this which is like prevailing thinking. So the wide gate is prevailing thinking. So Jesus is saying, look, in a couple of weeks we'll look at these passages where Jesus says, you've heard it said this, but I say this. In other words, there's prevailing thinking about the interpretation of the law, about the interpretation of Scripture. And we're kind of carried away with that. Like we're carried away by our tradition. We're in the stream of our traditions, in the stream of our narratives. We're in our stream of public opinion, which now is probably more the particular echo chamber we live in, right? So we're just sort of carried by those. And that's it. And there's a certain comfort level with that. And Jesus is saying, be careful, don't just get carried away. Don't just get carried into that big funnel. And it might be, well, our funnel's the right one, and theirs is the wrong one. Whatever it is, be intentional. Think this through. Maybe we need to disturb and disrupt some of our narratives about our own lives, about other people, about God, about life. Maybe we need to see things, stop and reflect to see things in a different kind of way. As we go through this series, we have this opportunity to rethink. And then finally, rock and sand. So Jesus tells this little story. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who builds his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. Now, this is we could spend all day on this one, all sorts of meanings to this, and it may be that Jesus is referring to the temple that's about to be destroyed, decades later. But whatever the case, what we can say here is Jesus is saying storms are coming, right? Storms are coming. Whether you've got a good house or a bad house, storms are coming. So we should expect storms in our personal lives, in our corporate life, in our social life, in our national life. And I don't think we need a lot of persuading about that, probably. So Jesus is just saying, okay, there is a way to stand. We don't have to get washed away. We don't have to get annihilated. We don't have to give up. There is a way to live. And he uses this metaphor of the house to say, this is possible. This is pretty much the last thing Jesus said. This way that I'm talking about, okay, so this is at the end of the sermon. This way is possible. And actually, it's essential because a storm is coming. And this world needs people to stand so that they can be salt, that they can be light, that they can bear good fruit. That's what the world needs. So as we go through, we'll wrap up here. We go through the series. Just want to touch on some ways to sort of frame it for us as we think about this as a journey. First one is, it's a lifetime commitment. Okay, so what we're talking about is profound. It's not easy. It's challenging. So 40 years ain't going to do it. 40 days. 40 years, yeah, probably not that either. But certainly 40 days, right? So it's not like, let's go through Lent and then we've got the Sermon on the Mount down, then we'll move on. So let's just recognize this as a lifetime commitment. Okay, so that, let's set that as an expectation. It's not linear. So we've probably addressed a lot of these issues before in our lives. I don't know about you, but I had ongoing challenges in my life. I was going to say unique struggles. We probably share our struggles with many other people. I have issues going on in my life where I take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes 5 steps back. I don't know whether you've experienced it. And you think like, oh, I feel I've made progress. And then, I don't know, you just get distracted, you drift, stuff happens. And did I ever make any progress on that? So it's not a linear journey, and that's okay. Let's keep addressing it. So we may, in this series, sort of come face to face with things like that we have to face, and we're like, that again? Really? Well, it's okay. Okay, 40 days isn't going to do it. So we're going to have things where we're going to keep moving back, forward for years. That's okay, but let's not give up. It's not a formula for success. So this is not put all these things into practice and then we'll have a perfect life. No, I don't think Jesus is saying, hey, it's not really a self-help manual, right? This is something different. It's actually an affirmation of the road less traveled. So it's that narrow gate. It's the lonely way very often. It's Jesus saying, if you're struggling, if you're poor in spirit, if you've had the breath squeezed out of you, blessed are you. Keep going. You're not far from God. Yours is the kingdom of heaven. If you're willing to make sacrifice, if you're willing to turn the other cheek, if you're willing to forgive your enemies, if you're willing to get walked over as a result of that at times, blessed are you. Keep going. Walk that path. And those things don't sound all that successful, right? They sound perhaps the opposite and certainly can feel very lonely at times. It's a journey to a cross. This season of Lent literally leads us up to Good Friday and Easter. It's about sacrifice. Jesus is not saying this is going to be easy in any sense, but it leads to resurrection because this is all about life. This is all about really living. It's about embodying the kingdom of heaven. So we're going to take communion now. So if the band would like to come up, we're going to do a little meditation, but we have communion, fruit juice and gluten-free crackers at the 2 sides here and in the middle. And we do this every week, as many traditions do, where we metaphorically eat bread and drink wine. It's fruit juice and gluten-free crackers. But to remember Jesus, because Jesus did that with his followers before he died. And so we're going to remember Jesus. We also have stations around the room, and in the bulletin you got, or if you click the QR code, you'll see, you can read about what those stations are. There's one for reflecting on and praying about racial justice. There's one for lamenting in the back corner there. There's places you can write out prayers. We'll also have people at the back who are available and willing to pray with you if you have a need right now that you'd like to share. So we all have this opportunity to touch base with somebody, or even reflect ourselves on whatever's going on in our lives right now, and not walk out those doors the same. We have this opportunity in these next few minutes. And so in a moment, whenever you're ready, just come and take communion. You can take it as a group around the table, or take the elements back to your seat and just eat and drink in a more solitary way, and that both of those are totally fine. But we're just going to do a little meditation first before Van lead us into a song. So maybe we could just put the lights down a little bit, Greg. And I just encourage everybody to close their eyes, just so we can focus. And I think it's good when we're reflecting just to focus on our breath. As we said earlier, a breath has this otherworldly, divine quality to it. Just breathe in. And as we, in this quiet moment, breathe in God's love, God's presence. So just encourage you to open your heart to whatever emotion or feeling you have at the moment. And especially if you're feeling squeezed, deflated, pressed,